Ciao Bambini. One of the things that sort of emerged out of doing the story of Rune Soup solo show the other week was not just that there's more to tell, but it might even be fun to, or at least for me, to tell some of the subsections almost of the Rune Soup story. And namely, I mean, it began as a blog, right? And back when people actually did blog, there are a couple of sort of cornerstone or key series that back in the day people definitely associated Rune Soup with. And so I thought I might do a video, just live stream a video kind of going over those series. And the first one that came to mind, probably because it sort of was the first main or big series, was or is the Whisky Rant. So I've got my boomer rectangle, which is quite correctly what I call the iPad, next to me with notes about it, because it was really fun to kind of, almost a decade later, impossible because I'm still 27, open up those old posts and see what stood up, what hasn't, where I may have changed my opinion on some of those things. But first I want to tell you about why it's called the Whisky Rant. And as a child of the 90s, I kind of grew up and was transformed by, 90s stuff like Graham Hancock, Fingerprint of the Gods, and so on. So the kind of idea that there are, which is a certain kind of true, forbidden versions of history and science and so on. And the Whisky Rant is, and I don't recommend this as a strategy, in fact, for any younglings watching it, was kind of how it was like my mostly unsuccessful go-to move to impress boys was like, buy me a couple of whiskeys and I'll tell you where Atlantis is, kind of stuff. Like, let's get some old maps. It was a different time, right? And so that's kind of what the Whisky Rant was. Like I had, and it worked a couple of times, which is where that came from. And one in particular, there was back in Newcastle. This was in college, and I was back in Newcastle visiting friends, and they had a friend over from Sri Lanka, and I started talking about and this is real Graham Hancock stuff. After the Boxing Day tsunami in the 90s, when the water rushed back out all alongside the Indian coast, there were all these ruins, right? Because of all the places to suggest that people have been occupying in a continuous civilization since the longest, or the longest that we don't think they have is a better way of saying it. India is the place, right? India in general, South Asia, right? So the great river valleys of South Asia. And so I mentioned it to this Sri Lankan guy, and he's like, how did you know about that? Because he grew up in some fishing town, I don't know, in Sri Lanka, and the fishermen all had stories of like the sunken cities and the sunken ruins and so on. And Sri Lanka is obviously, may not have been even part of the same civilization that these ruins that were that appeared after the tsunami were. But that was this kind of funny moment because we were drinking whiskey in the stairwell of my friend's apartment. And so that's kind of where the idea came from. A mostly unsuccessful attempt to woo boys. But it also captures kind of the energy of how you want to talk about things like this, because they are fun and they are late night rant kind of things. The world has kind of gotten very conspiratorial, as you've noticed in the last couple of years. So some of it, particularly with some of the other series, which we'll get to later, has has become a bit too real. But I opened the Whisky Rant series essentially ruminating on Pete Carroll's classic dictum from, what's this one from? The Psychonomicon? I believe so. That any conspiracy without internal conspiracies will rule the world. So it's sort of a piece on the idea that why I'm calling this a rant rather than a conspiracy is that there isn't overarching conspiracies to like occlude or occult history, for example. But there is kind of like the inertia of small minds and an inability. People in the sciences and in traditional disciplines like archaeology aren't necessarily taught that they are definitely going to be wrong, right? So something, and Dr. Sheldrake played a big role in, well, his material played a big role in the Whisky Rant. He would say that all science should be taught to some extent postgraduate. And so for the first year of any kind of science degree, all undergrads should be taught to do a year of the history of science, because you can go back 300 years and, you know, they're putting lead into people and bleeding them and it just got, you know, all these kind of phlogiston, all this kind of crap, right? But no one's taught that. Certainly not in medical school. They're taught that this is reality. They're like, this is how a heart works. And the thing is, it probably isn't. Like odds on, odds on it isn't going to be, right? So there's conspiracies, and there is an improper relation with the truth that comes from this sort of vainglorious, materialist, fixed universe enlightenment idea. It's decidedly unanimous, because an animist universe is in a state of perpetual formation rather than already formed. So that's sort of where I began with it. And looking back on that one in particular, I'm like, I should potentially have been less harsh on on conspiracies, given how the world turned out. But so the Whisky Rant, the main one for me was Atlantis, right? And I did end up, in many respects, writing a book elaborating on a lot of the Whisky Rant themes, right? So my first book, Starships, was on that, because the sort of one-liner is Atlantis is a culture-specific memory of this sort of universal experience of humans around the world, that we kind of used to be better at this. We used to live better, right? So in many respects, the Garden of Eden story is an Atlantis story, because it's the state of living where God is visible to you. Like, that's actually what people think. It's some sort of savage or superstitious idea, God's walking in the garden. What that means is that humans were living at a time where God was apparent to us in the natural world. And in the fallen state, that's not the case. And so Atlantis is a teachable tale of, we actually used to live better in the universe. And everyone has that. And whether that is, and it's a lot of things. The two main things I think this is my take, right, is that when we come to Earth, we have, even if it's not a conscious memory, we do have some awareness, some weird bodily awareness, that this isn't where we're from. And so it's sort of like a bodily awareness of, well, we call it the afterlife, but let's just say home, right? And there's also the sort of sense that there probably was, for the first couple of 100,000 years of human history, a better way of being in relation to the community of beings that is the cosmos. So if you look at how the Paleolithic and Neolithic people live, it's patently clear that the whole nasty, brutish and short thing is materialist, capitalist propaganda. And in fact, David Graeber, RIP, has a book on the history of human civilization coming out. Depending on when you're watching this, it might already be out. I've got it on pre-order, but it's out this month. And I hope to do a post about that fairly shortly. But he's essentially got, from the grave, he's written his own starships, right? So you actually, and this is one of the things I love about anarchism in the classic Kropotkin sense, is it is it's not just kind of like pointing at ways you can optimize industrial production like communism is, but it is a critique of, hang on, we lived better. Humans don't need states and kings and all the rest of it, right? So I'm looking forward to that. Well, I think that's the other part of Atlantis is, and this is a big sort of part of Starships, is that the whole kind of like Neolithic and Paleolithic in particular era is one in which we were in definitely better, let's say, right relation with star and stone and beast and all the rest of it. And this is just simply, it's borne out by like the lack of fortifications and all the rest of it. We didn't start turning into dicks until much later. And that's a real, genuine anarchist critique, and I think it's a good one. So that's sort of what, that's the preamble to the Atlantis part. But by the same token, humans have been here for a while, and there's a later Whisky Rant piece on interventionism, and I'll come back to that. At the same token, that's not to say that may well have been, and I think likely were, even using a classic European definition of it, whole are civilizations that are now gone, right? And so Atlantis is, on the one hand, an example of this idea that everyone has this sense that we used to be better at this, right? And even in the Amazonian cultures, same thing. We used to live in a more benign or better relation. But Atlantis, as described as a city, may also exist or have existed. And if it did, it is off the western tip of Cuba. And there's, I mean, the story of the Americas, starships had to be the story of how certain beliefs come out of Africa and effectively end up, because it closes with European magic, right? So it sort of had to end up how ideas from the Paleolithic and beings and spirits, hence the name Starships, a prehistory of the spirits, ended up in European magic, right? Because that's, for most people watching, that's going to be home base for them, although not necessarily. And consequently, it had to leave the Americas out because the spirit didn't end up in European magic via the Americas. And the book was already long enough. It's 110,000 words. But someone, and speaking of Graham Hancock, he didn't quite write this, but there's a lot in America before that's bad, but there's a lot that's good. The bad bit is that he spends the first half of it wailing on like the Clovis man hypothesis, which hasn't been current for decades. So yes, it was wrong, but anyway, the shortcomings of the genre, and he didn't invent it, but it's fair to say he defined it. The shortcomings of the sort of alternate history genre is that it has a didactic rhythm. It has to be opposed to officialdom. That's the kind of like exciting daring do of it, right? Like archaeologists say this city doesn't exist. Well, I went and dived on it. It's got to have that rhythm to it. And that really suited things like Fingerprints of the Gods. It was just tacked on awkwardly in America before. That said, there's some really cool stuff about how old human habitation in South America is, right? So someone's sort of written it, but the point is, once you posit something like, and let's just say the Olmecs, although again, speaking of like mainstream archaeology, there is and I think rightly, there's actually a blending of like early Maya and Olmecs, so that the civilizations aren't, again, because this is European artifact, right, aren't as discrete as we may think. Is sort of beside the point. What is the point is that where did these fuckers come from is a fair question. And especially as they start showing up, you know, as happens all around the world, this is real starships, at a time when there was a big sea level rise. So it's like, okay, well, this is a good suggestion is if they've just sort of showed up somewhere straight after a sea level rise, then there's probably stuff under the water where they came from, especially given that the majority of mankind still lives on the coast, right? So it's not just, well, why would they be living on the coast? Why wouldn't they? That's where we live. The food is there, you know. So if there is an Atlantis, and in the Whisky Rant you can talk about, I write about in the late 90s, I think it was, maybe it was the early noughties, an oil survey off the western tip of Cuba found like a sunken city, and you can have the you can look at the sort of heat map of them, and it's plainly a city of sort of, or a habitation of step pyramids and that kind of stuff that looks very Mesoamerican. So if there was an Atlantis, that satisfies Solon/Plato's criteria, because it's a great island in what can truly be called the Great Ocean. And if you look at the Americas, it's obviously combined Pacific and Atlantic, so the Great Ocean. And it's a seafaring city that's in the middle of a continent, which is impossible unless, well, it's impossible for any continent except for the Americas, because you actually have, well, two, but there's like an ocean in the middle of it. So you actually can put a naval city in the middle of the great island of the world, in the middle of the great ocean of the world. So there's a bunch of reasons where, and that was kind of the flex at the end of the Atlantis stuff. And that still holds up. in the sense of those structures are still there, and there is still a solve or a solve being asked for the origins of the civilizations of the Americas. Now, this brings me to a big shortcoming, and this is in Starships, but it's a big shortcoming with things like Ancient Aliens and why I've never been on it, is there is a unlovely, let's just say racist history of white people showing up somewhere brown and going, these people are too primitive to have built this. And the main one was India, coming back to it, right? So you had to invent Aryan invasions and all this kind of stuff because brown people don't build stuff that impresses white people, right? So a lot of the sort of lost civilization stuff is initially openly racist and intentionally so, and then because we don't really realize that, accidentally racist. So if you've ever watched any Ancient Aliens, and it's weird, right? They never, some of the stuff in India that like, how did they build this? And it's sort of 13th century, and you think, well, no one's doing that with Durham Cathedral, are they? No one's saying aliens built that. I wonder why. And I'm not saying the producers of Ancient Aliens are explicitly racist, but that is a racist position to take, which is, in the 13th century, how did the Indians build this? And in the meantime, cathedrals are fine. Humans can build that without assistance, right? So that's a problem. That's a problem with it. And also the whole idea of a lost civilization is lost to whom? That's the classic one, right? Like, so sort of slashing your way through the jungle to find a civilization that's next to a village wasn't lost to them, right? So it's, in the sense of lost, is not on European maps. So there's like a whole bunch of colonial power play in the story. It's not a reason not to be interested in it, but it is, it's the things that will bite you in the jungle. It's the accidental, like you can get way down a road of forgotten civilizations or whatever and go, wow, shit, I ended up pretty racist. That, like, again, accidentally so, but it can happen. And why your project shouldn't be abandoned is that it's also racist not to posit them. And the best example does come from the Americas. So when the Spanish showed up in Cusco, and they're looking at this incredible, and it is incredible, like stonework, big, that kind of classic marshmallow stone that's you can't fit bits of paper through, which is still just lining some of the streets of Cusco, right? The Spanish are like, how did you do this? And the Inca were like, it was here when we got here. Now, we don't say that. So the actual indigenes of the Cusco area, the Inca, said to the European colonizers, we didn't build this. And if you look at history now, it's still saying the Inca did. And there's no way they knew how, simply because they didn't. But also they weren't lying about it. They're like, we didn't build it. It was here when we got here. We built on it, right? So there's two ways you can be racist looking for lost civilizations. There's the immediate assumption that, you know, if it's a city in the jungle, it must be lost because the locals couldn't build it. And then there's the other side, which is if the locals tell you they didn't build it, listen. So it's actually one of the reasons I still find whole kind of like lost civilization stuff fascinating, because it's a really good example of, say, Donna Haraway staying with the trouble, which I didn't know at the time because she hadn't written the book. But that's the kind of like the main corner of the Whisky Rant was explaining away lost civilizations, I guess, and using it as an exciting way to get people interested in the fact, the macro point, which is that official, which is to say materialist history, is wrong. And frankly, and this happened after Starships came out, so again, long after the Whisky Rant was finished, I would get emails from anthropologists and archaeologists who've read the book, saying, we all think this. Like, you're not like, hey, congratulations, Gordon, you solved it. Nothing mental like that. But we all think this. We just are in an industry where we can't say it. And that was quite encouraging. And again, it's one of the shortcomings of the sort of lost civilization genre, is that you have to set up this antagonistic, daring-do alternate archaeologist versus mainstream one, and that is just not in play. And I did mention that because I definitely wail on science as an industry in the beginning of starships, but I also, and the same thing for Animistic, which is coming out, rely heavily on, and with humility and respect, actual scientific data, right? Because it's the politics of interpretation that fucks with it. It is a very valid and not singular method of truth validation. So anyway, that's kind of the Lost Civilizations part of the Whisky Rant. The other main cornerstone is interventionism, which is sort of what I meant before. There's a really cool one. It was my favorite at the time, called When We Met the Neighbors. And it was sort of my description of Terence McKenna's stoned ape hypothesis. And there's some of that in Starships too. And so interventionism in this case typically refers to the ufological idea that humans were or are the product of intervention, of planet intervention, hence interventionism. And so there's a couple of posts in there about interventionism, and I actually am one, and it was kind of one of the posts. Now, interventionism classically in this sort of forbidden history, ufological field, more forbidden history, is inspired by the writings of a guy called Zecharia Sitchin, who, if you don't know who he was writing in the possibly 60s, 70s, 70s, yes, 60s and 70s, about the Sumerian civilization being the product of the Anunnaki, which were these beings that came from their planet to build humans, to mine gold, to save their atmosphere. It's this whole kind of elaborate thing, but the gods arrived on nuclear-powered rocket ships and built mankind. That isn't a, how to say this right, that isn't a sophisticated or nuanced read of interventionism. Now, people have said a bunch of stuff about Sitchin that's wrong, like that he didn't actually know how to read the tablets, and he did. The error wasn't necessarily in the translation. His translations of things like rocket ship were actually valid. It's just the story isn't. When I say interventionism, and it's one of my favorite guests on the show, Dr. Wickramasinghe, the astrobiologist, speaking of Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan astrobiologist, was talking about how basically everywhere else in the world, excluding the US, although they probably did it in a clandestine way, is kind of aware that what we call viruses, let's just say protein strings, because the virus name is coming to the end of its utility, but basically genetic material and biological material arrives on Earth continuously from space. So the appearance of life on the first place on this planet is a result of interventionism, because all life comes from life. Like, not even in a computer have they been able to work out how much lightning has to hit some goo to turn it into it's stupid, right? It is stupid. To the point that even Richard Dawkins has directed panspermia as his explanation for how life arrives on the planet. And directed panspermia is, as it sounds, a rock sent to Earth, not like accidentally hitting it, because the numbers just don't work for that. So he has his own dumb theology to go with the rest of his dumb ideas. So I'm interventionist in that sense, and I think it happens continuously. I do think it's fair. So Terence, and you can watch the video, Terence had this thing that the mushroom itself came from space, and spores can survive in space, right? And my intervention framework doesn't require that to be so, but I think it is so. It doesn't require it, but it works. So that's kind of how I put the stoned ape and interventionism together, which is we were in some sense built. And we also know that you can adjust DNA or genetic configurations via resonance. So you can literally put genetic material that is coherent in one jar, and on the other side of the lab, you can just have the component parts, and they will not be in contact, but being near them, they will cohere, right? So what that means is you don't actually need nuclear-powered rocket ships to show up to have a reorganization of life. It can happen at the level of the field, which is, say, the level of spirit. So that opens up a whole bunch, like when I say, yeah, I'm an interventionist, we were built. I don't mean it in a Sitchin sense. I mean it in a way that I think is far more exciting and also continuous. So I gave a talk, again, this is after the Whisky Rant. I gave a talk, what year was this? 2018? Yes. At a UFO conference here in Australia called What If We're the Aliens? And I've got a reading of that in the membership area if you want to join, or if you are a member, you can find it. And basically I use the octopus as the example of a kind of like late update. It's the most interesting update in biology from kind of like, sort of like going from an abacus to an iPhone, going from a squid to a octopus. These things are basically telepathic, they're communicating with color, they're just hyper intelligent. They have the material, the genetic material that allows them to do all these things. Again, that's not quite true. The genetics is mostly wrong. But there's genetic material in the octopus that isn't found in any other being. And it's just kind of like inserted into the story of the squid. And all of a sudden we have what I literally think will be the organism that will replace humans as the dominant form of life when our time is done, right? So that happens a lot, and that's kind of what I mean by interventionism. Now, going back to the stoned ape hypothesis when we met the neighbors, this one is probably overdescribed, but nevertheless true, that as we were moving about the earth as humans, particularly, so the psilocybin's a saprophyte, which means, or the psilocybin mushroom, which means it loves chaos. So it grows on or in the feces of the prey animals we hunted. And if you look at the development of grasslands, a lot of them around the world may well have been created by humans to create grassland, to have habitat for prey animals. So we not only were following these herds, but we were actually altering the landscape in a way that made it better for us, which made it better for the psilocybin mushroom. So the encounter rates with these things would have been very high. And even if it was accidental ingestion to begin with, something like there would have been a contact event. Now, why I say it's overdescribed is now having much more experience with plant medicines, including ayahuasca. First of all, you don't actually need something at the sort of Terence McKenna 5 grams in 5 dried grams in silent darkness dose to get contact. I can do it now without anything. I worked at that, like that was as a result of going to the Amazon and so on. But my last medicine session was a really powerful one where I was surrounded by, I basically went there, and it's fun. I was talking to the shaman afterwards, and I thought, I went there this time. She says, I love it when that happens. But I was surrounded by these enormous plant teacher beings in spirit. And if you look at how Amazonian peoples or Aboriginal peoples continue to live, so it's a good assumption that they were probably living like that. Let's just go back 100,000 years, 50,000 years, whatever. It's a good assumption that that same level of teaching and being-to-being interaction was happening, right? And you can diet in the jungle all manner of trees and plants and shrubs to get the teaching of them. So I think the sort of sacred or healing medicines, the psychedelic ones, are one example, not the example of how that happened. I do think it happened. There are a few people in that sort of adjacent to stoned ape theory world who are saying that it's actually when we started eating fruit, which would be interesting. When we started eating fruit, because it contains different acids and sugars that the brain certainly thrives on, that was one of the things, as well as obviously eating the human fat. Like the idea that we were mostly vegetarian is wrong, but that doesn't mean we weren't eating, consuming plants, right? And especially when we started eating something novel, like fruit, that it appears to have had dramatic chemical changes in terms of different neural pathways and things. It's a good hypothesis. And I think, like the stoned ape hypothesis, it's one example of a thing that happened, which is to say, basically, not every, that's not fair. A good chunk of, I might even, without having done a count, say the majority of ancient or indigenous cultures would consider plants to be the teachers of everything, of the cosmos. Now, on the one hand, that's odd, because presumably a bear is smarter than a carrot, right? But on the other hand, it isn't, because they were here first. And it also just seems to be the case. That was why I mentioned the most recent medicine session, that these beings were clearly old and they didn't exist solely to teach us, but they're kind of like divinely appointed, for want of a less problematic term, function in the cosmos was to teach us idiots. So because there were things that were required of us, which we are definitely not doing, right, here on Earth. But there are things that are required of us that they would teach us how to do. We are supposed to be custodians, right? So that would be the modification to the When We Met the Neighbors one, which is I focused on, and I still think this happened, I focused on the entheogens, but that would have been one example of contact, right? And the famous, and this is still true, how you actually create ayahuasca in most instances in the jungle is the leaves of the chacruna bush and obviously the kapi vine. And you have to put them together. And there's no, because it's obviously the most diverse place on the planet, from a plant's perspective, is that right? Or is the Daintree? No, it is the most diverse. The Daintree is just oldest. Because it's the most diverse, the numbers of like, what are you going to do? Start cooking this one with this one, and then this one with this one, all through the Amazon until you land on ayahuasca. And of course, famously, it's like, well, the spirits told us. And that creation story of ayahuasca is different for different peoples, and there's two of them in animistic. But that only looks weird from a Western perspective. But if the tradition of plant teaching, as in being taught by plants, is much, much older, which it is, so that's like humans have been taught by plants since there have been humans, right? Then it makes perfect sense, because it's, well, this one said to go with this one and blah, 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 right? So that's the only modification I guess I would make on the When We Met the Neighbors series. I'm going to check the rectangle. What else have we done? Time. I'll do that one last, because I want to come back to UFOs, right? And we actually just finished in the members area, which was really fun. And this is potentially why the story of Rune Soup and why I want to do this series happened. But the Q3 course, which is available if you join, or they're all available if you join, was on UFOs, fairies, and psi. So it actually got my head back into this kind of material and these kind of books and all the rest of it. And I had to get, like, because obviously, and this is true, right? The mid-20th century UFO idea of little green men in rockets and flying saucers and whatever coming to Earth and sticking things in people's butts is not good, right? So the majority of these phenomena, and this is obviously the work of people like Jacques Vallée, the majority of the phenomena that we associate with UFOs needs to be better understood in a magical framework, most especially ones that include some kind of fairy lore. And so that's hence why the course. That being said, that doesn't mean that there aren't biological organisms elsewhere in the cosmos, of course. So, and the most compelling material I have for that is the old stuff. Now, I interviewed Dr. John Brandenburg for Skeptico 2016, a while ago now, and I think he has the best information and also the best stories, because he doesn't. One of the things about Christians is that they sincerely believing Christians are, in my experience, less likely to lie. It's different when you're talking about priests abusing children and what have you, but those kind of like, you know them, those kind of ones aren't going to lie much, not like about a big thing. And so he's a plasma physicist who has found a weapon signature in the Martian atmosphere that he believes means that they were about 500 million years ago, give or take, half-lives are like that, bombed from orbit by nuclear weapons. So, and there are, of course, as far as most people can tell, ruins on Mars. And when I say most people can tell, the interesting thing about Mars is that pretty much from the beginning of the 20th century, it was assumed that there was stuff on Mars, to the point that the New York Times in like the 20s or 30s was saying, like, how are we going to communicate with them? Can we like burn? One of the examples was, can we burn pi, as in this, probably not the Greek symbol, but can we burn a representation of pi into the American grasslands so that it could be seen from Martian telescopes, right? So this idea that there isn't stuff on Mars is in fact new. And it's new because it was probably of military or national security significance in the post-war era. So people were quite open about UFOs up until the development of the national security state. What a shock, right? So, but especially once Voyager and the rest of it was sent there, it's become apparent that there's shit on Mars. And Dr. Brandenburg was sort of around in the time when that was happening and working at JPL. And I got to see Paul Lafole just before he died, amazing artist who gave a talk in London. He's an American artist. And he was a multiple experiencer, like UFO abduction stuff. And he knew people from NASA and JPL, and he's like, listen, they've known since the 70s that there's stuff on Mars. Like, it's kind of open and shut, and so this idea that the face on Mars has been debunked or whatever is claptrap in aggregate, right? Because there is stuff on Mars, and more importantly, a better way of saying that is people, 4-star generals and people with national security clearances believe there is stuff on Mars to such an extent that it is still a national security issue, right? So this is what I mean by sometimes it's aliens. There may not be anyone on Mars at the moment on account of that bombing, perhaps, but there are ruins on Mars. And similarly, there is something on the moon. But the moon in general, like Arthur C. Clarke said the moon, what was this? Someone asked him if he'd ever seen a UFO, and he said, yeah, the moon. And it's true, like it's too old, and it's in the wrong kind of orbit. It shouldn't spin the way, or not spin the way it does. It's too old, it's too big, it's too close, it doesn't spin right. And when I say it's too old, it's older than the Earth, and none of it, like at the moment it's a double impact attempt to model how it's supposed to be there. It's supposed to be an ejected part of the planet. None of that stuff, and it rings like a bell, none of that stuff. So the moon itself appears to have been parked there. And that's Arthur C. Clarke saying that, right? That's not, that's not nobody. So it's not just, so the moon itself might be a UFO in the sense that we have not identified it and it flies. But there's also stuff up there. And I use Richard Hoagland's material in the Whisky Rant, which I go in and out of, because the other thing that seems fairly obvious is that a lot of the moon footage is faked. That doesn't mean we didn't go to the moon, but if you actually take the time and seriousness to watch some of the, like there are repeating backgrounds, there's all this kind of stuff that makes you go, that isn't right. And you speed it up and all that kind of rest of it. And we're still taking photos in black and white like it's the 60s. The story is and the original film's missing, and the United States is trying to have all the Apollo sites on the moon, no fly zones, so, like for satellites, so China satellites and whatever, orbiting the moon, so that, like, to protect the integrity of the historic sites. You look at this and go, there are lies there. I don't know what happened, but there are lies there, right? But the main one for me was, of course, Ingo Swann, amazing artist and remote viewer, was given some coordinates to remote view something, and turned out to be a base, and he's like, there's this stuff here, and there's these 3 vehicles next to these sort of dishes and whatever. And as he's going through the process, he's like, this is on the moon, isn't it? This is on the backside of the moon. And the guy's like, thank you, this session is over. And remember, Ingo remote viewed accurately that there were rings around Jupiter before Voyager had got there. And to find that there were rings around Jupiter. He's like, no, it's going to have rings and they look like this and whatever. So the guy who can correctly view stuff in space, viewed a base on the backside of the moon. So for me, those are the two. There are probably others, right? But those are the two when I say sometimes it's aliens. And I'm perfectly prepared, particularly in the case of Mars, for those so-called aliens to be what Dr. Farrell would call our genetic cousins, and may look as beautiful as this, right? I'm perfectly prepared for that to be the case, but like an organism living on Mars is by definition a Martian. So sometimes it's aliens, is the point, right? And those aliens exist in a living cosmos in the same way we do. So it's not an either-or when it comes to like UFOs or fairies or something low resolution like that. In the same way, it's not either-or that fairies were just UFOs, we just didn't have the words for it. So that part of it, I'd maybe leave off a little bit more of the Hoagland stuff. Hoagland's Mars material is still good. And speaking of Graham Hancock, he says that history will be kind to Richard Hoagland, and that may well be when it comes to the Mars stuff. Some of the moon stuff, some of the things that he thinks are anomalies may be like backscatter on a film set and all the rest of it, right? Maybe, but I don't know. It's sort of immaterial to there being stuff on Mars. It's sort of like you could. That's why I stick with Ingo for the moon, and Dr. Brandenburg and Hoagland and the rest of them and the others for the Mars material, so that you don't get caught in the, if it turns out that some of the moon footage is faked, and I think it is. You don't get caught in the, see, there are no ancient aliens on the moon. I'm like, well, first of all, I didn't say that, and second of all, Ingo, right? So the last one is time. And it's more about, and I think this would be the one, and this is because I've completed that shamanic series of initiations and lineage certification this year. And particularly the way Alberto teaches these things, Alberto Violdo, shamans work outside of time. So part of opening ceremony is to step out of the Kera conception of time. And we sort of know that's true. Well, that's the weird way of saying it. If you look at some of the prayer studies that demonstrate that people who are prayed for in hospital recover faster, it turns out that's even true if you pray for people who left hospital like 8 or 9 years ago. And so you split them up into groups, and you might pray for them. Let's just say this research is 2002 from memory, maybe 2004, but we'll just use an example. So today you get split into groups, or you get randomly allocated out of 200 patients. 100 get prayed for, 100 don't. And you pray, and the ones who get prayed for, you look at their results and go, yeah, look, they recovered faster than the 100 who didn't. And then it turns out that they all left hospital 10 years ago. So that act of praying today somehow has that retroactive effect. So I quite like that one. It focused mostly on divination, because going back to that sort of Pete Carroll idea that you enchant long and divine short, which is to say, there are baseline accuracy requirements, I would posit, for people who do practical magic. And I don't think many people, certainly not at the moment, satisfy this criteria, which is, and this is from Pete, but like, if more than half, like, it's a reasonable expectation to say that more than half of your divinations will be accurate. Now, I obviously teach tarot, and I'm working on a Lenormand course and a Lenormand deck and fortune-telling book, which will be about all kinds of fortune-telling at the moment. And so a big part of that is in the tactics, so questions and ceremony, and asking the right question and using the cards correctly, or the devices correctly, whatever it happens to be. But I think that's reasonable. And the other thing he said was, however, if like more than half of your enchantments come off, you're effectively all powerful. And that was kind of what I meant when I'm playing with the idea of time in one of the final ones, was entangling with the future one way or the other. And you seem to entangle, well, you're sort of more aware of the entanglement when you're doing divination, but it's presumably happening when you're doing sorcery and the rest of it. And there are solves for and I think shoaling is one of them, but there are solves for the getting your enchantments to work more than half the time, and that's to kind of, which is again classic material, but not part of this this video, is to sort of chunk objectives so that you can move things that have a higher probability underneath it and keep resetting and doing it that way. And that's the kind of like, that's the both hands of paper magic, right? Like cards on the one hand and sigils on the other. So paper always beats rock. But yeah, so that was the final one, and it was mostly about prediction. And so I guess if I would change it, but I wouldn't have known that stuff at the time, I would also include other forms of retroactive enchantment. But the whole why it was in the Whisky Rant is because it sort of began talking about the past, and it brings the question of what even am the past then? Like, so if we're entangled, let me put it this way: if we do not have time correct, and we definitely don't if we experience it solely as linear, and I don't think we do experience it as linear. I actually think we experience it in a much more fluid and elastic sense. and we're just told we experience it as linear. Because my whole thing, especially for the last decade, has been around cycles, and having this blended cycle model, which is the fact that, and I spoke about this at Astromagia, and this is definitely an animistic. Astrology works because the universe operates cyclically. It doesn't operate astrologically. So astrology and other cycle model, Kondratiev waves, Martin Armstrong's Socrates stuff, all the rest of it, are examples of thinking cyclically. And again, you have the Maya daykeepers, you have this idea of stepping outside of time. We experience time, whole life flashing before our eyes, afternoons with lovers that go forever, or even worse, like waiting for a delayed flight, which goes forever, ever. We experience time differently, and what is time but that experience, you know? So I think I would have, but anyway, this is why it's in the Whisky Rant, because if we're talking about the deep and ancient past, that invites you to consider in what kind of relation you are with the past. Is it some kind of alive to you, or is history one damn thing after another in that capitalist sense that the past is gone and irretrievable, which isn't, the data don't bear that out, and neither does our experience. So that was sort of this kind of final piece of it. But it was mostly about really fun stuff, like Atlantis and UFOs and aliens and so on. And all of that has, when I say it's held up, it has, but it's a difficult thing to take down. So it's probably not the right way of saying it. It has, my takes have maybe become more nuanced, but they haven't changed. Where they might have changed, or where they've changed the most, is around the whole "when we met the neighbors" hypothesis, my version of stoned ape, where I would say that I think the stoned ape thing happened, but I think it's one encounter with one class of beings. Well, not one encounter, but it's encountering one class of beings amongst many others, right? And there's a whole bunch of you who are like deep into your plant magic and herbalism and so on who'll be vibing on that. It's like, yes, I don't actually need to ingest rhododendron to be in a teaching or tutelary relation with it. So that's the general idea. But yeah, that's the Whisky Rant. It was fun. It is fun. I think about it sometimes, and yeah, this was good. It was good reminiscing for me, and also to get my thoughts put together. So I think we will do the next series over the next week or so. The next few: Apocalypse Pharmaca, K Economica, and of course Archanology, which might have to happen on Odyssey and Rumble. So hopefully, if I've remembered, you will see the Odyssey and Rumble versions of this below the YouTube one as well. You might as well just link, if you want to hear the Archanology one, you might as well follow now. All right, that was fun. Ciao.